Now, sometime back, I went over to Drew Fisher's neighbor's house and I ripped up some of his mahogany and walnut hardwood flooring, and I thought this would be the perfect project for this beautiful wood. The prep on this wood was fairly simple. I had to cut off the grooves from the tongue and groove boards and then straighten all the edges just to make sure everything would work out well. It was then over to the planer where I had to remove the grooves that are on the bottom of all of these wood floor planks. That was about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more of wood that had to be removed. But I just ran these through until I had a nice flat surface on the bottom edge of these boards. It does create a lot of dust. I flipped them over and ran the finished edge through the planer just to remove just a thin layer off the top, just to get that old sealer off of there. And you can tell from this shot how pretty this wood really is. Now it's time to glue these up into panels. Once I had several panels glued up, I would run them through the planer just to kind of clean up a little bit of glue squeeze out and just make one final pass to get these things nice and flat and surfaced on both sides. Now I took the side panels over and created a nice little jig just to cut some 45s on the edges, as these are going to be the sides of the box and they're going to be joined with mitered edges. I took the time to pre-measure each of these to make sure that I had the right width on the sides. You may notice that on these boards there's a groove there on that upper edge, actually 2 grooves. I had measured where the bottom of the inside of the box was going to be, and then there'll be a space where there's a drawer at the bottom of the box, so both of those grooves will hold the bottoms of each of those sections. You'll see a little bit later in the video how that works out. Now here I'm running the bottom through the planer just to get it to the exact thickness of that groove that I had cut. I just kept running it through until it was a nice fit. Now the top of the box will have a little plexiglass inset into it, and this is me just trimming down the framing that'll go around that. And there's a little dado edge cut in that'll allow for that plexi to sit in. And this is just fitting it at the right length to get that 45-degree miter edge. I quickly kind of clamp the box sides together to give me the right lengths to actually adjust and measure and cut these to the exact size for fit. And then it was just simply gluing up those 45 miters, clamping them together with this Bessie strap clamp. I really love this clamp for projects like this. It makes it much simpler. Now here you can see the dado that I was talking about where the plexiglass will sit. And what I'll do is get that cut down to the right size, and then I'll sandwich it in with some of the interior wood. I'll show you that later on in the video. Plexi is actually really simple to work with. I measured it to the right size and then I just cut it with my miter saw. It does create a lot of hot pieces coming off of that thing as that plexi melts, but it does cut it very smoothly. with the glue dry, I can test fit it on the base of the box. And what I want to do is give that inside edge a nice round over. So I grab my trim router and run it along the edge. Well, that didn't go as planned. As you'll see, that dado groove in there didn't give my router bearing a place to run. And yes, I had to cut that out and redo the lid. So I ordered this Spanish cedar from Rockler to line the inside of the humidor, and boy does it smell good. I was sniffing it. Glued up these thin pieces into panels that'll fit the inside of that box. This Spanish cedar is good for humidors because it doesn't absorb a lot of the moisture in the air, and it keeps the cigars from drying out by reflecting the moisture. It also keeps bugs and kills any critters that might be in the tobacco. To keep this simple, I just adjust my saw to 45 degrees, bevel the edges of these strips of cedar, and then I just cut them to length to fit down inside the box where they miter into the corners, just to keep it a nice little pretty corner inside the box. The cedar strips were just a little bit shorter than the sides of the box, so I just set them in there and marked a line. Took the box back over to the saw, just trimmed the top part of the sides off, so now the cedar will just set right down inside and come flush top of the box. Here I'm just laying out the bottom panel for the box at the base of the drawer. So this is the very bottom of the box that you'll see. Now onto the front. What we need to do is get that front panel set up there and then mark out where we're going to cut out for the drawer. So I just laid that out and went ahead and just cut right through the bottom in on my bandsaw. Cut out that face from where the drawer is going to sit, and then as you'll see in a minute, I'll just glue that entry cut through the base back up and you won't even notice it. And then you just exit out of your entry cut. And that little slit will get glued up and you won't even hardly be able to tell it's there. And here it is, gluing it up. Just squeezing some glue down in there and throwing it in the clamp for a few minutes. Now on to the drawer box assembly. All I'm doing is just trimming it down to size to fit into that opening and just squaring off each of the edges for now. I'll probably put a little decorative design to this piece because you will see it when you draw it out of the box. But for now, we'll keep it simple. Now what I decided to do was to dress it up just a little bit, so I'm going to put finger joints on the edge of these boxes, and I created a little jig modeled after, I believe, Bourbon Moth. Jason Hibbs with this one, this design. But if you want to see a link to that video on how to build this, I'll include that in the description below. But essentially I run each edge of the box over my dado stack with that jig, and it creates these finger joints that interlock. And then here I'm just putting in a groove in the bottom of those to support a 1/4 inch panel. It's just a plywood panel for the bottom of the drawer. And then I'll actually line that plywood with a little felt. It's a stick-on felt that you'll see later, but those finger joints with that plywood really locks this thing in and holds it nice and tight. Now switching back to the regular blade. One thing I hate doing is switching my blades back and forth. Now I'm just trimming the bottom of the drawer down to fit exactly in those grooves with just a tiny bit of wiggle room. And I'll glue up those finger joints, but I do not glue up the insert there for the bottom of the drawer. And the way that I like to glue these up, I do lay it out flat, run my sander over the inside, because you'll never get a chance like this to sand the inside of that box after it's glued up, but get it nice laid out and flat, and then I put painter's tape down just to protect the inside of the corners once it's glued together, because again, once you get this box all put together, it's difficult to get in there in those edges and get that cleaned up. And once you've got 3 of the sides glued up, you can just slip that bottom in there and then sandwich it all up, close it up by just putting on that last piece and then clamping it together to hold it for a few minutes while it dries. Now, to keep this simple, what I decided to do was just run a strip on the side of the drawer that will slide in between 2 runners that are on the inside of the box, so this thing will just slide in and out by friction. Rather than clamping this together, I just put a little CA glue in with wood glue, spray a little activator on there to lock it into place, and that way I don't have to worry about trying to clamp this thing down. And that's it. That'll hold it in place until that wood glue dries. It gives me a great bond to the sides of the box there. And then I just lay out again for where the 2 runner strips will go on the side of the drawer. They'll slide on either side of those. And it's simple just to cut a little dado through there to allow them to run on those strips. Now, after one final dry fit, it's time to give everything a good sand. So I start with the drawer itself and sand it down, and then I lay out all of the pieces of the box and get that all sanded on the inside. Again, it's better to go ahead and get it sanded now than to wait till you glue it all up and try to sand it then. But simply just glue on the mitered slots there, get the bottom of the box lined up, and the bottom of the drawer box, we'll call it, in there, and run those strap clamps from Bessie around it to hold it in place until that glue dries up. But you do have to make sure this thing stays square, and I have the hardest time with this thing, and really anytime I'm cutting miters I have a very hard time getting nice square corners on these. I'm not sure if it's the angles that I cut at 45 or what it is, so any tips and suggestions on getting these 45s to sit better would be very helpful. Just leave them in the comments below. Believe me, I read them all. You'll see here as I get this cedar all laid out that it just slides right into place. Little tap tap and it's in. Getting this last piece glued in locks it all into place and gets that inside of the box completely lined. And it's at this point I do put a couple of strips sandwiching in the plexiglass on that lid as well. Now for the drawer, I do have to put a little lock back there to keep that thing from sliding all the way in and but I have to get it measured just right so I can get a face frame on that edge of the drawer. I use playing cards as spacers, that way you can count out equal number of cards, and you know that by sliding them in there your face is equally spaced apart. And once you get it all set up with the number of cards, I just added a little CA glue to temporarily hold this face frame in place. Get it on there, get the cards set back in there, again evenly spaced. Give it a few minutes for that glue to activate and set up, and then simply just lay out where my drawer pull is going to be. I'm going to drill a hole straight in where the drawer pull is going to be, attach a screw from the inside, and that screw will just simply hold the face frame on and hold the knob. And there you go. Now to lay out where the hinges fall for the lid, I simply just mark off the edges of where the hinges are. I put the hinge down and I kind of etch around it with my marking tool, and that gives me a nice line to be able to use a chisel to cut out just a little bit of that wood to let that hinge kind of set down in the wood. And yes, those are cheap big box store chisels, but they do the trick. I do the best I can to keep those things sharp, but they're not easy. Buy yourself a set of nice chisels. I will eventually. And then I just repeat the process for the lid, laying it on there, marking out exactly where that hinge is going to fall with the marking knife. And again, those etches from the marking knife give a nice little edge for that chisel to set down in. And here you can see where I cut those strips of Spanish cedar and sandwiched in the plexiglass, which, sorry, I didn't show that on video. I use a self-centering drill bit to drill some pilot holes and then screw in the hinges. Now I decided to add some accent pieces to the mitered corners of this box, and it also adds a little bit of strength as it gives a little bit more gluing and bonding. But I don't remember exactly where I learned how to make this jig, but this jig holds a box at 45 degrees and allows me to run it across the top of my saw blade to cut a slit on each corner of the box. Then if I stick a little glue in there, I can cut off, and in this case I used a little bit of the cedar, cut off little strips and slide them in there, and that gives it a little bit of a offsetting color. Once the glue dries, you just take your flush trim saw and cut off that excess, and do the best you can not to break them, because they do tend to break off and then they'll leave you a little tiny gap that you'll have to fix. But in this case, I was very fortunate that nothing broke off, but I came very close. After all that's set up and dried and cut down, then it's simple just to take your sander, sand it down flush, and go ahead and sand the edges of the box. And I sand these down to 320 for its final finish. I protect the cedar because I don't want to get any of the oil on the cedar. I want it to be raw woods, so I protect it with some painter's tape. I also put a little bit on the plexiglass just to keep the oil off the glass and not have to clean it up later. Okay, so I do like to have a little fun sometimes. I decided to finish this with tung oil. I really like how that finish holds up. Simply just rub it on there, let it dry for really 24 hours, and then come back and wipe it all down really good and rub it on again. As you saw there, I do like to use a Q-tip on some corners and edges that it's hard to get to. A Q-tip is perfect for getting down in there, getting that oil really saturated on that wood. My favorite part, watching that wood come to life when you rub that oil on there. Just can't help it. I just love this part. Get that oil all over all sides of it. And here I'm using the Q-tip again to get in that nice, that little corner, that edge. And I get the top edges of the wood without getting it on that cedar. I also do the inside of that drawer box just to make sure that all sides have a little bit of a finish on them, because you don't want wood to soak up moisture from the air in different ways and warp on you. Now, the reason I said my wife did not want me to build this is that my son requested this for him and his house, and I don't think my wife is too happy about him enjoying a cigar every once in a while, but I really love how this turned out. I built that little insert drawer that sits on top of those runners, and it's also made out of the same Spanish cedar, so the inside of that thing is completely lined with Spanish cedar. I love the drawer. It can hold an ashtray, cigarette lighter, cigar lighter, your snippers, whatever you want to put down in the bottom down there. I think this project turned out great.